Imagine driving on a busy highway and coming upon a toll booth or an express lane sign. You might wonder, wasn't this road already paid for by our taxes? Why are tolls popping up everywhere? We see these refrains all over social media, especially RCTC's pages, the operator of toll lanes in Riverside County. The reality is funding roads has never been simple. For much of the last century, we paid for highways primarily through gasoline taxes, an elegant system that tied road funding to road use. But over time, that system has faltered, and tolls have reemerged as a key tool to fill the gap. This episode dives into how we got here, focusing on California's experience while comparing it to toll-heavy states like Texas and Florida. We'll explore the history, the 1970s freeway rebellions in California that left LA's network incomplete, the chronic shortfall in tax funding, new Sacramento policies aimed at discouraging higher capacity, and why tolls, once mostly limited to bridges in California, are now being used to finance new roads and lanes. The goal is an even-handed factual look at tolls as a funding mechanism for road construction, so you can understand the trade-offs without the political noise. While Calimesa doesn't have toll lanes, and none are planned anytime soon, many of us travel on toll roads or tolled lanes in our commutes, so it's worth understanding how they work and why they exist. Let's hit the road.
This is the Calimesa Insider Podcast, the original Pass Area City podcast, focusing on the ins and outs of your city government at work. And now here's the host of Calimesa Insider, City Manager Will Kolbow.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Calimesa Insider. I really hope you enjoyed listening to our last episode as much as I enjoyed doing it. Our city is so lucky to have Darlene, so if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend that you do so. For this episode, I wanted to turn to a topic that we've talked about before, and that's road funding. We've talked about gas taxes a bit on episode 48 and how they're distributed, but we didn't talk about funding levels and other forms of road funding. One of the ones that's been making a comeback is the concept of tolls, which is a true user fee. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding as to why that is and why our taxes just aren't cutting it anymore in terms of pure road funding. Now, an argument could be made that other forms of taxes should go to roads, but this conversation is going to focus on how there's always been an effort to tie road users to funding together. So the users of the roads and the funding need to be tied together. So toll roads are hardly new. They've been around for centuries in one form or another. In the U.S., tolls were a prevalent way to fund roads before the gas tax era. So, for example, the famous Pennsylvania Turnpike, opened in 1940, was financed by bonds and paid for through tolls, and it became America's first modern superhighway. That traffic was far above what planners predicted. Its roaring success kicked off a toll road boom after World War II. Soon, many states, especially in the East and Midwest, built their own turnpikes. New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, Kansas, Florida, and others all jumped on the bandwagon for tolls in the 1940s and 50s. These roads were funded by users, not taxes. States actually created toll authorities that sold bonds to build the road, then repaid investors with interest from toll revenues. California, however, took a different path in that era. Aside from a few exceptions, notably toll bridges like the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge, which charged tolls to pay off construction bonds, California's highway network was largely built toll-free. The state preferred to use fuel taxes and other revenues to finance roads, a philosophy shared by federal highway officials of the time. In fact, a 1939 Bureau of Public Roads report rejected toll financing for a planned national highway system, arguing that in most places traffic would shy away from toll roads if a free alternative existed. Early California leaders agreed. They raised fuel taxes and other fees to build roads and generally reserved tolls for big bridge projects rather than ordinary highways. This is why in the mid-20th century you'd pay for a toll to cross the Bay Bridge or Golden Gate, but you could drive LA's freeways or Highway 99 in the Central Valley without ever stopping at a toll booth. So the advent of gasoline tax radically changed road funding. Oregon instituted the first state gas tax in 1919, and by the late 1920s, every state had followed suit. The idea was simple and clever. Drivers pay a few cents on each gallon of gas, and that money goes to road construction and maintenance. The more you drive and the heavier your vehicle, the more gas you burn. So in theory, you pay roughly in proportion to your road use. Gas taxes were often seen as a fair user fee and far less hassle than stopping to pay tolls every few miles. The federal government got into the game in 1956, creating the Highway Trust Fund, funded by a national gas tax to finance new interstate highway systems. The feds offered to pay 90% of the cost of interstate highways, an almost irresistible deal for states. This massive infusion of gas tax money meant the bulk of American freeways built from the 1950s through the 1970s were non-tolled or quote-unquote free roads in common parlance, though of course paid for by fuel taxes. So many toll roads that predated the interstate system were integrated into it. So in 1957, about 2,100 miles of existing tollways in 15 states were officially added to the interstate network, but they didn't become free. Law allowed those routes to keep collecting tolls so that bondholders could be repaid. After all, if Washington had forced states to remove tolls, someone would still have to foot the bill. Either the government would have to pay off the bonds, or taxpayers at large would subsidize those highways. So instead, those early turnpikes stayed tolled, and drivers understood they were paying extra for a faster or more direct route. So by around 1970, America had a dual system: tax-funded free highways, including most of the interstates, and toll roads, mostly in areas that had big turnpikes or expensive bridges. California at that point still only had toll bridges, no toll roads or turnpikes. Driving in California was overwhelmingly toll-free, thanks to healthy state fuel taxes and federal aid. Now, the 1950s and 60s were the golden age of freeway construction, especially in California. Planners in 1959 unveiled an incredibly ambitious highway plan: 12,241 miles of freeways crisscrossing the state. Los Angeles County's plan alone envisioned a dense grid of freeways, one roughly every 4 miles, so that no matter where growth occurred, a freeway was always nearby. Now, by the mid-1960s, many of LA's routes were built or under construction: the 10, the 405, the 605, the 210, and of course others. It seemed that building highways was just a matter of political will and steady funding. But then things changed. Construction slowed to a crawl in the 1970s, and many planned routes were never completed. So what happened? In California, people often point to the freeway revolts. So all across the U.S., public opposition was rising against new highways that threatened neighborhoods, parks, and environments. In the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, activists stopped freeways that would have sliced through the heart of San Francisco. In Los Angeles, community groups fought projects like the Beverly Hills Freeway and the extension of the Long Beach Freeway, the 710, through South Pasadena. Environmental laws such as the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and California's own Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, gave citizens and local governments new tools to question or block highway projects. As a result, by the late 1970s, Caltrans had formally abandoned the 1959 Freeway Master Plan, acknowledging that many routes would never be built. Now, LA's vast freeway network remains incomplete by design. You can spot it on maps, where freeways like the Glendale Freeway, suddenly stop instead of connecting through, largely because their planned extensions were defeated by community opposition. However, public opposition wasn't the only factor, or even the biggest factor. A critical and less glamorous reason was money, or lack thereof. By the late 1960s, the highway program was running into financial headwinds. The cost of building roads was escalating rapidly, far outpacing the fuel tax revenue that, in earlier years, had seemed plentiful. Building a mile of urban freeway is getting more and more expensive due to inflation, more complex designs in dense cities, land acquisition costs, and other factors. And the gas tax per gallon was not rising to keep up. In California, the state gas tax had last been increased in 1963. In Washington, the federal gas tax hadn't been touched since 1959. Simply put, highway budgets couldn't stretch far enough, and projects started to be delayed or removed from the program for lack of funds. An analysis by academics in 1993 found that the principal reason California and most other states stopped building freeways was that the freeway program began running out of money in the 1960s. Even before the famous No More Freeway stance of Governor Jerry Brown, first elected in 1974, California's freeway construction had already peaked. The state was completing fewer miles each year after 1967, regardless of policy, because the dollars just simply didn't go as far. Now, to make matters worse, political leaders were reluctant to raise gas taxes to keep up with inflation. The LA Times noted that a failure to increase gas tax during the 1970s was one of the factors that doomed the expansion of the freeway system, alongside the freeway revolts and rising costs. Essentially, from the late 1960s onward, the highway program had to triage. Maintenance of existing roads started eating a larger share of funds, while many new projects were shelved. California formally cut back its highway plans in 1975 and redirected attention to transit, carpooling, and other alternatives. Nationwide, the interstate program itself was largely built out by the early 1980s, and the flow of federal money for new roads slowed to a trickle. The legacy in Southern California is a freeway system that, as designers would say, never quite got finished. Now, LA today has notorious traffic, and part of that is because some planned freeways that might have provided alternative routes were never built. In fact, only 61% of the lane miles of the original 1959 plan were built. Now, here's a map of just some of the unbuilt freeways in red. Gray routes with a route number were the roads that were built. The ones that did get built often had fewer lanes or lower capacity than originally envisioned, assuming parallel freeways would handle some of the load. Freeways which then didn't materialize. So, for example, going back to the Glendale Freeway, was supposed to continue south and meet the unbuilt Beverly Hills Freeway. Today, State Route 2 ends in a surface street, dumping traffic because planned downtown LA connection was killed. The Long Beach Freeway, I-710, still has a northern stub that was meant to extend to Pasadena, a gap that forces traffic onto surface streets and other freeways. And across the region, traffic became more concentrated on the routes that did exist because there were no parallel expressways every 4 miles as once hoped. In short, Southern California's freeway rebellion combined with funding shortfalls left a mixed legacy. We saved some communities from bulldozers and smog, but we also ended up with choke points and an undersized network in an era of explosive population growth. So the gas tax was a brilliant 20th century innovation that funded the interstate era, but over the last few decades, it's since faded. One issue is that gas tax rates haven't kept up with the times. The federal gas tax is still 18.4 cents per gallon, the same rate it was in 1993, over 30 years ago. In that span, general prices have risen dramatically, more than 65% since 1993. So the buying power of that 18.4 cents has shrunk to about 7 or 8 cents in early 90s terms. Many states likewise kept their fuel taxes static for decades. California, for example, we went from 1994 to 2017 without a single increase in the base gasoline excise tax. Think about that. The state added millions of residents and probably millions of cars in that time. Roads aged and needed repair, construction costs went up, but the main source of highway funding stayed at a flat 18 cents per gallon for over 20 years. It doesn't take an economist to predict a funding crunch from that scenario. So what about fuel taxes being tied to road usage? Now, in principle, if the amount of driving, in other words, vehicle miles, kept rising, even a flat per gallon tax will bring in more money. And indeed, Americans drove more and more each decade, which did boost revenue somewhat. But two counterforces hit: vehicle fuel efficiency and alternative fuels. Now, since the 1970s, federal regulations have steadily pushed manufacturers to improve gas mileage. In the early 1980s, the average U.S. passenger car got about 20 miles per gallon. Today, new cars often achieve 30 to 40 miles per gallon, and hybrids much more. This means a driver can travel a lot farther on 1 gallon and thus pay less taxes for the same road used. As one report bluntly put it, the original gas tax model has a failing in that tax revenue doesn't automatically account for how far you drive or how heavy your vehicle is. It's only tied to fuel consumption. When cars use less fuel per mile, the link between road usage and tax paid weakens. And of course, if you drive an electric vehicle, you don't pay a fuel tax at all. EV owners continue to still contribute to road funding in some places via special registration fees, but those are often modest compared to what a gasoline driver paying tax at the pump would contribute. The trend is clear. Without changes, gas tax revenue per mile driven will continue to decline. One study projected that in states with no tax increases or indexing, fuel tax revenue could drop about 40 to 50% between 2015 and 2040 due to improving fuel economy alone, even before a large EV uptake. That's a huge gap emerging in how we pay for roads. Now, in preparing for this episode, I wondered whether early gas taxes contemplated maintenance. So initially, the gas tax, both state and federal, was seen as a way to fund construction of new modern roads. For instance, building the interstates or expanding state highway networks. In the mid-20th century, maintenance wasn't an urgent budget item because many highways were new. But road maintenance eventually became a major cost. Asphalt and concrete wear out, bridges need retrofits, etc. Over time, more and more of the gas tax revenue had to go towards maintaining existing roads rather than building new ones. So by the 1990s, California was directing a large share of its fuel tax money to highway rehabilitation, safety upgrades, and operations. This shift created a political challenge. Taxpayers feel they're paying more but not seeing new projects, while engineers know that if you neglect maintenance, you end up paying much more later to rebuild a failed road. And this was understood even in the 1940s. Highway officials at the time argued that deferring needed road maintenance was a penny-wise, pound-foolish strategy because a neglected road would cost far more to fix later. So yes, gas taxes were always generally intended to cover both construction and upkeep of highways. The problem is one of adequacy. The rates were set in an era of cheaper construction and have not kept pace with growing needs and costs. So by the 21st century, neither California nor the federal government was raising enough through fuel taxes to maintain, let alone expand, the road system at desired levels. In fact, a few years ago, California's own assessment found an enormous backlog of maintenance and repairs on roads and transit, a big rationale behind the 2017 gas tax increase, also known as SB 1. That law not only raised per gallon tax, but also indexed it to inflation going forward to avoid past mistakes of letting it stagnate. Even so, California's gas tax, now around 59 cents per gallon for the state plus 18 cents federal, has to stretch far. It fixes potholes, repaves highways, services bond debt, improves transit, and yes, contributes to some new capacity, but not nearly enough new lanes to satisfy demand in many regions. So let's illustrate how the two factors of lack of inflation adjustments historically and increasing fuel efficiency has contributed to the gap. I was able to trace average miles per gallon calculations back to 1966. And this year is also around the time that concerns of fuel taxes weren't keeping up with the cost of building and maintain roads. So as you can see on this graph, fuel efficiency actually dropped a bit during the 1970s, but after the gas crisis of the mid-70s, automakers shifted towards more fuel efficiency. Environmental concerns have pushed public policy towards mandating even higher fuel efficiency standards to where you now get 67% farther on a gallon of gas today than you could in 1966. Now let's set that aside and switch to the gas tax for a moment. The blue line represents the actual gas tax per gallon rate, and the orange line indicates the inflation-adjusted gas tax from 1966. In other words, we had to adjust the gas tax rate annually based on inflation starting in 1966. It would have followed the orange line. While it looks like there was a sharp increase to the gas tax in 2011, this was actually a result of a fuel tax swap. The state eliminated most of the state sales tax on gasoline, 5 percentage points that had been dedicated to transportation, and replaced it with a per-gallon price-based excise tax that the state adjusts every year to raise about the same revenue the sales tax would have raised. In other words, the line item excise rate jumped in 2010 to 2011, but the combined burden was designed to be revenue neutral. Even with this factored in, we are still below the gas tax per gallon we had we adjusted annually for inflation since 1966. So now let's factor fuel efficiency and price per gallon together to calculate a tax per mile. This is where it is most telling as to how much we are investing in our road as a user charge. The blue line indicates how much we are paying per mile, factoring in both the price per gallon and the average miles per gallon of consumption. If we'd indexed based on the tax per mile back in 1966, it would have followed the orange line. If we had just adjusted the tax for inflation, it would still be the green line, which goes to show that increased fuel efficiency has contributed the most to our funding deficit, not the price per gallon. So from the period of 1966 to 2023, the state collected about $155 billion in taxes. If the gas tax per gallon had been adjusted annually for inflation, total taxes would have been about $260 billion. An additional $105 billion. Further, if we had looked at it from a tax per mile perspective, about $377 billion would have been collected, or about $222 billion more than what was actually charged. Now, one caveat that should be noted is that you cannot look at one type of tax in a vacuum. Oftentimes, when one tax lags, the gap may be filled with other taxes. There are indirect taxes built into fuel that are charged to the refiners, not the end users, which largely ends up being passed on to the consumer as the refiner's cost of doing business. Also, other taxes, most notably income taxes, a purely state tax, will fill the gap. The taxes that usually lag are the ones that are wholly or at least partially local taxes. In other words, cities and counties, shifting the share of taxes to the state and federal governments, as we have talked about in previous episodes of the podcast. Now, another point to quickly make here is that although we have been focusing on highways and regional roads, local roads also rely on gas tax. So from that perspective, road maintenance in cities becomes harder to fund because of the same problem. The cost of maintenance is rising faster than the amount of tax revenue coming in to pay for that maintenance. So to summarize, by the 2010s, the traditional highway funding approach was hitting a wall. Fuel taxes lagged behind need, in large part due to political reluctance to raise rates and success in reducing fuel consumption per mile. General inflation in construction, for example, the cost of labor, steel, concrete, land, etc., outpaced the flat gas tax. The result was predictable. We accumulated deferred maintenance, rougher roads, aging bridges, and saw fewer new road projects. In this context, states, regardless of political leaning, started searching for other funding mechanisms, and that brings us to tolls making a comeback, albeit in new forms. So anyone who's driven through a major road construction project in California might wonder why it takes years to widen a freeway a few miles, and why costs can balloon into the hundreds of millions or even billions for a single project. Now, there are several reasons, especially in California, that drive up the cost and timeline for new road capacity. In many parts of California, especially metropolitan areas, land is extremely valuable. To build a new highway or widen an existing one, the government often has to buy property. This could be empty land, scarce in cities, obviously, or it could mean buying out homes, businesses, or other facilities. Those costs are huge, sometimes comparable to the construction cost itself. By the early 1990s, Caltrans officials openly said that real estate costs and public opposition, often tied to environmental concerns, were so high that building brand new freeways in urban Southern California had become nearly impossible. A vivid example of this was the Century Freeway, the 105 in Los Angeles. Planned originally in the 1950s, it wasn't finished until 1993 due to community lawsuits and delays. By the time it was opened, the freeway's cost was $2.2 billion for 17 miles, or about $127 million per mile, making it one of the most expensive highways ever built. Much of that went to buying thousands of properties and even funding construction of replacement housing for displaced residents as part of a legal settlement. Now, California has some of the nation's strictest environmental regulations, as we all know. Building a road triggers review of impacts on air quality, water, wildlife, noise, communities, and many other things. Complying with CEQA and federal NEPA can take years of studies and public comment. Often, lawsuits or the threat of them force agencies to revise plans or add mitigations, like building sound walls, wildlife crossings, or relocating endangered species. Now, while these steps are crucial for responsible planning, they do add time and cost. Moreover, the delays itself can inflate costs. One study noted that many cost escalations blamed on environmental requirements in the 1970s were actually due to inflation during the extra years of planning and litigation. Now, when a project that could be built in 5 years instead takes 10 or 15, the price tag rises because construction costs tend to increase year over year, and you might pay contractors overtime to accelerate work once you do start. In the Century Freeway case, a 5-year delay for an environmental study added nearly $5 million in cost, and that was just one small piece of the puzzle. Now, modern projects often must also navigate laws protecting historical sites, parks, requiring public input at multiple stages. California's process isn't the fastest, to put it mildly. Now, California's geography and seismic activity impose extra demands on road builders. Bridges and overpasses must be built to rigorous earthquake safety standards, especially after lessons learned from the 1971, 1989, and 1994 quakes. This can mean more steel and reinforcement, special design features, and redundancy, all of which raise costs. Now, mountainous terrains might require massive earthworks, retaining walls, or tunneling, which is very expensive. In urban areas, squeezing a wider road into a tight corridor might involve building retaining walls or even double-decker structures. So, for example, part of the I-635 LBJ expansion in Dallas cleverly built new toll lanes under the existing highway by digging a trench because they couldn't easily widen outward, an innovative solution, but one requiring complex construction techniques. High design standards for safety, durability, earthquake resistance are absolutely beneficial in the long run. California's highways and bridges are safer for it, but they do cost more upfront than, say, a rural road across flatland in a low regulation state. Now, in a populated area, you usually can't just shut down a highway to build a new one in its place. Agencies must keep roads open while expanding them, which leads to intricate staging, temporary lanes, night work, shifting traffic patterns, etc. Contractors often do the bulk of work at night or in very narrow work windows to avoid huge traffic jams. Now, this makes the project take longer. You might only get a few hours of productive work per day in some cases, and you incur higher labor costs for night shifts and overtime. Plus, every temporary rerouting of traffic requires setting up barriers, signage, and possibly renting additional right-of-way, all extra work that wouldn't be necessary if you had an empty corridor to build on. In one local example, the I-15 Express Lanes project in Riverside County added 2 lanes in each direction while keeping the highway open. Crews had to constantly reinforce the work zone to protect drivers and workers and do much work off-peak. That's far more complicated than building on a blank slate. So California's labor wages are relatively high, partially due to prevailing wage laws and the high cost of living, which increases project bids. There are also legal costs, for example, dealing with lawsuits or lengthy right-of-way negotiations, and the general overhead of California bureaucracy, which critics argue is inefficient. Now, whether California actually overpays compared to other states is a matter of debate, but some studies have found that our per-mile construction costs to be on the higher end, as you might expect. One could point to Caltrans management of mega projects. For instance, the new eastern span of the Bay Bridge cost multiple billions, far above initial estimates, partially due to design changes and contractor issues. All of this is to say, big infrastructure is inherently costly and perhaps more so in California due to a combination of factors that we just discussed. Now, to illustrate, recall that Century Freeway example. $2.2 billion for 17 miles, including enormous spending on mitigation. Over $300 million went into building replacement housing and job training programs for communities impacted. It was a unique project in its social commitments, but it shows how far things had come from the simple days of bulldozing a path and laying pavement. The Century project also included building a rail line in the median, the Green Line, as part of the settlement, so it wasn't just a highway, but a multimodal corridor. In the end, the Caltrans spokesman at the opening in 1993 said flat out that this was likely the last new freeway Los Angeles would see because real estate is too expensive, environmental concerns too prominent to allow more freeways in the region. That statement has held true in the decades since. LA hasn't built a new freeway since, focusing instead on transit and limited expansions of existing roads. Here in the Inland Empire, however, the gap in the 210 between the 57 in San Dimas and the 215 in San Bernardino was closed in the 2000s, though it had been on the books as a planned freeway for decades prior. The only way new highway capacity has been added is by finding creative ways to pay for it, which often leads to tolls or public-private partnerships, as we'll discuss. As an example of creative ways to pay for it, going back to the taxpayer per mile scenario indexed in 1966, if we had collected that additional $222 billion over the 57-year period between 1966 and 2023, we increased the per mile cost of the Century Freeway from 1993 to 2023 dollars, about $267 million per mile, it would be enough to build another 830 miles of freeways. For comparison, the LA metro area only has 670 miles of freeways. On the other hand, some figures show that the same $222 billion could fund over 600 years of fare-free mass transit, or maybe 2 California high-speed rail projects. Maybe. Now, when people see congestion and see new housing tracts or shopping centers being built, a common reaction is those developers should have to pay for the new roads. Indeed, there is logic to making growth pay for the infrastructure it requires. Development impact fees are one tool used for this. In California and many states, local governments can charge one-time fees on new development to help road improvements, widen intersections, and even add highway interchanges needed due to growth. These are not taxes per se, but they function as you build it, you contribute to the public infrastructure charges. However, there are important limitations to what development fees can do. By law, impact fees must have a rational nexus to the impact of the development. In plain English, authorities have to justify the fee by showing the new homes or businesses will generate a certain amount of traffic that necessitates a certain amount of road capacity, and the fee can only fund that proportional share. You can't just make the developer pay for fixing pre-existing congestion or maintenance backlogs. For example, if a city's roads are already falling apart, you can't slap an extra huge fee on a new subdivision to repave all the streets citywide, only the portion attributable to that subdivision's traffic. This principle keeps fees from being abused as a general revenue source, but it also means new development can't legally be charged to solve current deficiencies, only to offset its own impacts. Now, in practice, this means development fees rarely cover big-ticket items like entire freeways. They tend to fund things like local street widening, improved intersections with traffic signals, maybe a new intersection or auxiliary lane if a large master plan community is going in. They supplement tolls or taxes, but don't replace them. A striking example comes from Orange County, California, which built a network of toll roads in the 1990s, specifically using a combination of toll revenue and development fees. Initially, planners expected nearly half the toll funding would come from development fees on new homes and offices in the area served. The estimates in 1985 anticipated about $416 million from fees, or roughly 48.5% of the total cost. Now, this made sense on paper because the toll roads, such as the 241 and the 73 and others, were opening new areas for development. So these new developments would pay for the roads via fees, and drivers would pay the rest via tolls. But reality diverged from the plan. The real estate market and land use decisions changed. The Irvine Company, a major landowner in the area, ended up scaling back development in parts of the toll road corridors and dedicating a lot of land for open space and conservation instead of housing. Fewer houses built meant fewer fees collected. Also, the cost of the toll road projects turned out higher than initial estimates due to some of the factors we discussed: construction delays, higher standards, and other factors. By the late 1990s, after the toll roads were built, the numbers told a different story. Even though the agencies managed to collect more in fees than first thought, the fees ended up covering only about 30% of the Foothill Eastern system and just about 17% of the San Joaquin Hills system. In other words, development contributions fell well short of 50%. The rest had to be shouldered by toll payers and some remaining bonds. The shortfall has been one factor in the financial struggles of these toll roads. They saw lower than projected traffic in earlier years and had to refinance debt. It illustrates while development fees can be crucial seed money, and indeed Orange County's toll roads likely would not have been built without them, they often don't fully materialize at levels hoped. Economic downturns like in 2008 can dry up new construction for years, meaning that anticipated fee revenue disappears until building resumes. Now, another real-world data point is the city of Fort Worth, Texas, uses transportation impact fees to help fund road expansion in its growing suburbs. They calculated that with the city's rapid growth, they need about 6 miles of new arterial roads per year. After a recent fee increase to about $3,000 per new single-family home, that extra revenue only covers about $1.5 million, 1.5 miles of road per year. That's only a quarter of the need. The rest has to come from other sources like state funds, bonds, etc., or not be built at all. Fort Worth's case is not unique. It shows that if you try to make development pay 100% of new infrastructure, you'd have to set fees astronomically high, which could price people out of homes and bog down economic growth, not to mention likely violate that rational nexus if overcharging beyond the development's true impact. Finally, the public often demands that developers pay for roads, and indeed they do contribute, but those contributions are limited. Politically, impact fees are more popular than general taxes. Everyone likes the idea of those newcomers paying for the problems after all. California cities and counties, especially fast-growing inland areas, have leaned heavily on development fees for local road improvements. They help, but they can't usually fund freeways. Freeways serve regional travel, existing and new residents alike, so it's a broader burden. And this is why large highway projects almost always require state or federal funding or toll financing in addition to local developer fees. If we try to make only new development pay for a $500 million freeway interchange, we simply wouldn't get the money in time, or at all, because development happens incrementally and each project's fee is a drop in the bucket. So in summary, development fees are one piece of the funding puzzle, but they can't bear the entire weight of new road capacity. They are best used in combination with other tools. Orange County's toll roads, for instance, were financed by a mix. About $1 of every 3 comes from fees, the rest come from toll-backed bonds. When the fee portion shrank, the toll and debt portion had to grow. The public might feel developers get away without paying enough, while developers often feel they pay a lot. Those fees can be many tens of thousands of dollars per home. Both can be true. They pay a lot, and it's still not enough for the big projects. So another reason that new roads and capacity are difficult to build in California is, although it may look different today, it's a reason that has its roots in the freeway revolts. In recent years, state leaders have decided that expanding highways actually makes congestion and pollution worse. There's a concept called induced demand. When you widen a freeway, it doesn't stay clear for long. People drive more, traffic fills back up, and greenhouse gas emissions climb. That's why in 2020, the legislature passed Senate Bill 743, which completely changed how transportation projects are reviewed under CEQA. Instead of asking, will this project reduce traffic delay, we now ask, will this project increase total miles driven? Now that's called vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. And if a project increases VMT, it's considered an environmental impact that has to be mitigated. So what does that mean in practice? If Caltrans or a local agency wants to widen a freeway, they now have to offset the added driving by also funding things like transit, bike lanes, or other improvements that reduce car use. That adds costs, time, and complexity. And in some cases, projects just stall out. One high-profile example is going back to that 710 freeway expansion in LA. After decades of planning, Caltrans pulled out in 2022, saying it no longer fit the state's climate and equity goals. Instead, the state is directing more money to transit, rail, and multimodal projects. That makes sense in places like LA or the Bay Area, but it's much tougher in smaller communities like Calimesa, where cars are the only real option. Yet the rules are the same everywhere, which can make it harder to approve even modest road improvements in suburban or rural areas. There's also a tension with the state's housing push. California is telling cities to build more houses, not just in big cities, but in suburbs and exurbs too. But in those areas, more homes almost always means more driving. So under the new VMT rules, those projects face higher hurdles or expensive mitigation fees. In San Diego County, for example, more than 10,000 approved homes in unincorporated areas were put on hold because the developers couldn't meet the VMT requirements. Critics argue that that's backfiring. It's pushing people to live even farther away in Riverside or the high desert and commute longer distances, which only increases VMT. Now, the state is experimenting with new solutions like letting developers pay into a statewide fund that supports affordable housing near transit to offset the impact of suburban development. But that's still new, and many worry the cost will simply make housing even less affordable. So where does that leave us? In short, California is deliberately slowing down freeway expansions, betting big on transit and alternative modes of travel. That may help with climate goals, but it creates real challenges in car-dependent places like Calimesa. It also raises tough questions. How do we grow housing and jobs in areas that don't have rail or major transit when the state is discouraging more road capacity? This policy shift is yet another reason tolls and managed lanes have come back into the conversation. Because if we do add capacity, the state wants to see it managed, paid for by users, and paired with transit solutions. So all these factors, insufficient gas tax revenue, high costs, limits on other funding, state policy discouraging more roads, set the stage for tolls to make a comeback as a road funding mechanism. But the tolls of the late 20th and early 21st century are a bit different from the old coin drop toll booths of the past. Let's look at how tolling is being used now, especially in California, and compare it to other states. So by the 1980s, California's leaders realized that certain critical highway projects in rapidly growing areas, Orange County notably at that time, simply weren't going to be built with traditional funding. So in 1987, the state legislature authorized the creation of joint powers agencies that could build toll roads and issue bonds outside the normal Caltrans highway program. This led to the formation of the Transportation Corridors Agencies in Orange County. They built a network of limited access highways through what were then the edges of suburbia, roads now known as by their route numbers, the 73, 133, 241, and 261, totaling 51 miles. These were built in the 1990s as toll facilities using revenue bonds backed by future tolls and development fees. By 1997, all were open to traffic. Today, they carry about 250,000 trips each weekday, providing an alternative to the freeways for commuters in South and Central Orange County. The Orange County toll roads were unique for California. They were entirely new highways financed without gas taxes. If you don't drive on them, you don't pay for them, an attractive proposition to lawmakers at the time. The flip side is that drivers who do use them pay quite a bit. Fees can be several dollars per trip, and those have increased over time to meet bond obligations. The Orange County toll roads have had a rocky start financially, lower early traffic and revenues than forecasted, but they refinanced their debt and remain operational. The model proved that tolls could fund major new road capacity in California, something that hadn't been done in decades. And then starting in the late 1990s and 2000s, California also began experimenting with high occupancy toll lanes or hot lanes, often branded as express lanes. These are typically lanes added to or converted from HOV carpool lanes or on freeways where solo drivers can choose to pay a toll to use the lane for a faster trip, while carpools usually continue to use it for free or at a discount. The first such project in the U.S. was actually in California. The 91 express lanes in Orange County opened in 1995. Those were 4 lanes in the median of the 91, built by a private company under a franchise and later transferred to public ownership of OCTA, and then operated with variable tolls, higher at rush hour, lower off-peak, to keep traffic flowing. LA County followed much later, converting the 110 Harbor Freeway carpool lane and the I-10 El Monte busway into toll lanes while keeping them free for 2 or 3 person carpools in 2012. The Bay Area has been adding express lanes on the I-680, 880, and 580 and more, and again, typically using existing carpool lanes and charging solo drivers. San Diego has its I-15 express lanes, and many more are planned, including a marquee project to add express toll lanes on the heavily congested 405, which actually just opened recently. These projects are usually financed by a mix of funds and the expected toll revenues. They aim to manage congestion by pricing the lane to maintain high speed and raise new revenue for transportation improvements. Now, from a funding expense perspective, express lanes are a partial solution. They don't pay for an entire freeway, but they can pay for themselves and even generate excess revenue for transit or road fixes in the corridor. So, for example, Orange County's transportation agency, RCTC, recently built new express lanes on I-15 and is extending them, largely funded by toll-backed bonds. They explicitly moved forward on a $544 million extension only after voters upheld the state gas tax in 2018, which gave them the confidence to cobble together the remaining funds needed. These lanes address a paradox. People are frustrated with traffic and yet lack public funds to add capacity, so giving drivers the choice to pay for a faster option is one way out. Politically, it's sometimes easier to implement toll lanes, which affect only those who opt in, rather than raise taxes on everyone for general highway expansion. Now, of course, hot lanes raise equity questions. Are they Lexus lanes or where only the well-off can use? And practical questions. In heavy traffic, even toll lanes can fill up, so pricing might spike to very high levels and deter too many users. But California is in places like Texas have moved forward with them. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, for example, the Tex Express lanes on several highways, which are essentially the same concepts as our express lanes. The DFW region also did massive public-private partnership projects to rebuild freeways and includes the LBJ Express on the I-635 and the North Tarrant Expressway on I-820 are examples. The LBJ Express, a $2.6 billion reconstruction of 13 miles of I-635, added 6 new toll-managed lanes, largely built with private financing through a consortium led by Cintra, a Spanish firm, and will be operated by that private group for 52 years to recoup their investment. Texas used this approach to stretch public dollars. TxDOT has contributed some public funds, in the LBJ's case, about $490 million, but the majority came from private equity, loans, and bonds repaid by tolls. Essentially, Texas leveraged tolls to get highways built now rather than wait decades for hypothetical gas tax increases. Florida, similarly, has been widening parts of the Florida's Turnpike and other roads using tollback bonds. Their Turnpike Enterprise is a state-run but self-financed agency that keeps expanding the toll network as needed. Orlando's Beltway, for example, is partially tolled. Other toll roads nationally, it's worth noting that toll roads are common in many states, busting the myth that tolls are only some kind of uniquely California or East Coast phenomenon. Texas, for example, has over 25 tolled roads or tolled segments, including Austin's Loop roads and the Dallas North Tollway. Florida has one of the most extensive toll systems in the country, not just Florida's Turnpike running north-south, but also the Miami Expressways, the Central Florida Expressway system in Greater Orlando, Tampa's Selman Expressway, and others. Oklahoma operates an entire network of turnpikes. Georgia introduced hot lanes around Atlanta. The list goes on. The common thread is that these states also faced funding shortfalls. For example, Texas has kept its gas tax at 20 cents per gallon since 1991. That's even longer than California went without raising ours. Rather than increase it, Texas lawmakers for years preferred toll projects and also diverted some general sales tax into highways. In 2015, Texas voters approved dedicating some general funds to roads, but they had also a temporary surge in toll projects before a recent political pushback against tolls occurred. Florida actually does index its state gas tax to inflation, so it inches up annually, and yet the demand for new highways in its booming metro areas still outstrips what those taxes can fund, hence the reliance on tollways. So in short, all states are grappling with the same math. If you don't raise gas taxes enough and you still want new roads, tolls become the tool of choice. This cuts across red and blue political lines. The decisions are often more about urban versus rural needs and attitude towards user fees versus taxes rather than simple party ideology. So one controversial idea is tolling existing highways, something basically not done in the U.S. except on some bridges and tunnels. The public and laws have generally required that tolls only be used on new capacity or new roads, not double charge people for a road they've already built with taxes. However, there are pilot programs and discussions about converting some freeways to toll to manage congestion, also known as all-lane tolling, or converting HOVs to hot lanes as already done. The general rule is that interstate highways built with federal funds can't just start charging tolls on existing lanes unless a specific federal pilot or if they are reconstructed. So we're unlikely to see I-10 through Redlands become a toll road all of a sudden without major reconstruction. Now, politicians know that would be deeply unpopular. Instead, what happens is toll lanes get added alongside, or occasionally, as in New York City, tolls are considered for entering a congested downtown, which is called congestion pricing. But California hasn't gone that route yet outside of bridges. Now, let's address the paying for the same road twice complaint more directly. It's a common refrain. We pay gas tax, which was supposed to build and maintain the roads, so if I have to pay a toll, aren't I getting double taxed? There is some validity to that frustration, but it depends on the scenario. If a toll is on a brand new road or lane that wouldn't exist otherwise, then it's not really paying twice for the same road. You didn't pay for it the first time because your gas taxes were never allocated to that project. For example, the drivers on the 73 toll road in Orange County are paying for that road through tolls because it was never a free road funded by taxes. In economic terms, they're paying once via toll to use a road that, absent tolls, simply wouldn't have been built at the time. The FHWA once responded to a similar question by pointing out that toll facilities incorporated into the interstate system were built without federal money, so the motorists on those roads are not being charged by both the state and feds for the same facility. If the toll is on an existing facility that was originally tax funded, then yes, one could argue you've paid for the construction via taxes and now you're paying again to use it. This is the case for the converted hot lanes in LA. The I-110 and the 10 were built with public funds decades ago for carpools and buses and now have a toll element for solo drivers. Critics say it's double dipping. However, supporters counter that the toll is paying for enhanced service, enforcement, and additional transit options. For example, LA's Express Lane program uses a chunk of the toll revenue to fund improved transit lines and carpool rider incentives in those corridors, theoretically giving riders alternatives and improving overall mobility. It's also a way to manage extreme congestion. The carpool lanes in LA were often overcrowded themselves because so many people or carpool or game the system. By adding a toll for non-carpoolers, they can regulate the demand and keep the lane flowing at 45 plus miles per hour, which was not guaranteed before. In essence, you're paying for reliability and time savings, not literally for the asset that was already there. Whether that feels meaningful, like a meaningful distinction, is up to the individual person. Now, the optics of paying twice do make implementing tolls politically delicate. That's why California usually pairs toll projects with choice and new capacity. They rarely take something away that was free. Either they add a new lane that's tolled, or if they convert a lane, they ensure the general purpose lanes remain as they were. Drivers still have a free option, so you're not forced to pay except by your own decision to use the premium lane. The 2018 gas tax repeal debate in California touched on this. Some opponents of the gas tax hikes pointed at toll plans and said, see, they raised our taxes and still want tolls. We're getting squeezed twice. The counterargument was that without a mix of funding, many projects can't happen at all, and that smart tolling actually benefits even those in the free lanes by taking some cars out of the free lanes and into the paid lanes, reducing overall congestion. Voters in that case chose to keep the gas tax increase in place, showing a willingness to invest, but there remains healthy skepticism of tolls in some quarters. So at the end of the day, whether it's through a tax at the pump or a toll transponder by the windshield, drivers pay for the roads. As the saying goes, and as an industrial group quipped in 2018, nothing is free. Roads, bridges, tunnels, maintenance, all cost money and would be paid for with either a tax or tolls or a combination thereof. There really are no other magic sources. It comes either from the broad base of taxpayers or the users of specific roads. Historically, we've relied on broad-based fuel taxes spread among all drivers, which worked when everyone paid roughly enough. Now, as the base funding falls short, we're relying more on specific users to fill the gap. Toll payers on specific facilities, local sales tax measures in specific counties, etc. This shift has pros and cons. It can target funding to where it's needed and engage the private sector through toll concessions to stretch dollars further, but it can also raise issues of fairness and access. It can be confusing. People may not realize that a shiny new express lane might be funded completely differently than from the regular lanes next to it. For Calimesa and the Inland Empire, Tolls have not been a big part of the local road network yet. We don't have toll roads out here. No, the 91 express lanes don't quite reach us, but they stop in Corona. But many Inland Empire residents commute to job centers in LA and Orange counties, and they increasingly encounter toll facilities. The express lanes on the 91 freeway into Orange County, which Riverside has extended eastward. The upcoming extension of the I-15 toll lane south of Corona, and from the 60 to the north in San Bernardino County, or the possibility of future toll lanes on the 10, San Bernardino County. Indeed, recently added toll lanes on I-10 west of the IE towards LA County, and there's going to be future phases of that project as well. So while our daily local driving remains toll-free, understanding tolls is important for us making informed decisions about how on which routes to take and how to budget for commuting costs. If you value your time highly, an express lane toll might be worth it on a gridlock morning. If not, you can stay in the general lanes you've already funded through gas tax. At least having a choice is something previous generations of drivers didn't have. You either stayed in traffic or you didn't travel. Now, money can buy time, for better or worse. In conclusion, toll roads and toll lanes are not about double paying. They're about finding a viable way to build and maintain roads in an era when the old funding model no longer matches our needs. California's approach is becoming more similar to places like Texas and Florida in practical terms, using tolls where it makes sense, even if philosophically we arrived here from different angles. It's an apolitical reality check. Everyone likes smooth, uncongested roads, and someone has to pay for it. The tools are raising revenue broadly or charging directly for use, or usually a mix of both. As we've seen, both methods are being used around the country regardless of politics. Moving forward, we'll likely see more innovation, perhaps road user charges or for miles driven fees, or more dynamic pricing to manage demand. The debate will continue, but it should be rooted in facts. In the long run, you don't get what you don't pay for. Our job as citizens is to decide how we want to pay for it. And tolls are one answer that's resurfaced from our past to play a big role in our future mobility. So that's going to be it for this week. Please join us on Saturday, August 30th for our 35th anniversary celebration, which will take place from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Myrtlewood Drive between Calimesa Boulevard and 5th Street. Food trucks, vendors, a carnival area, and live music are all in store for this trip back to the 90s. We hope to see you there. Our next City Council meeting will not take place until Monday, September 15th at 6 p.m. at the Norton Young Love Senior Center, 908 Park Avenue. You can attend live and in person, or you can catch it live or on demand on the city's YouTube page at calimesa.gov/YouTube. Follow, and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Calimesa Insider, all one word, or visit calimesa.gov/podcast for all of our podcast links. Until next time, I'm Will Kolbow. Have a great weekend, and I will talk to you again next time. Take care.